"She's not your daughter," the nurse whispered, her voice soft enough to sound like a blessing and cruel enough to split my world in half. I thought she was delirious. I thought it was the morphine talking. But the way she looked at me, calm, almost relieved, made something deep inside me turn to ice. Her hand was small and weightless in mine, and before I could ask what she meant, her eyes drifted shut, and the room filled with the silence that follows a truth too heavy to finish speaking. I sat there for a long time, staring at the pale line of her mouth, waiting for it to move again, waiting for her to take it back. She didn't. And that's I live now. People just see the cardigan, the thinning hair, the hands that tremble when I pour tea. They say age softens the mind, but in truth, it sharpens memory like a blade. She was the senior nurse, the kind who could calm a screaming patient with a single touch. We were friends for more than 50 years, sisters in everything but blood. I cared for her when her sight failed, and she cared for me when my husband died. She was there the day my daughter Clara was born, and the day my husband Miguel brought me home, pale and exhausted, with a baby wrapped in a pink blanket. I never doubted any of it. I never questioned the story of my own family. Why would I? Life gives you enough ordinary pain. You don't go looking for more. That night, after leaving the hospice, I walked home through the mist, my shoes soaking through on the cobblestones. The air. "She's not your daughter." The words replayed again and again, not as accusation, but as an invitation to look deeper. I made tea I didn't drink, sat by the window, and tried to recall every strange moment from the past I had politely ignored. There were more than I expected. I remembered the birth itself, or rather what little I remembered of it. They had put me under longer than usual because of complications. When I woke, Miguel was holding the baby. He said she had arrived early, that everything had gone well. But there had been a moment, I recalled now, when I felt a pulse of confusion. The baby's cry seemed distant, disconnected, as if coming from another room. I dismissed it then as exhaustion. Later, I would notice how Clara's eyes were the pale blue of Rosa's father, not the dark brown of mine or Miguel's. People said children change colors as they grow. I accepted it. Acceptance was my habit, my inheritance from a generation taught not to ask too many questions. When Clara was 10, a neighbor at a birthday party said, "She doesn't look a thing like you, Elena. Must take after her father's side?" I laughed, the way women laugh to keep peace, and told myself resemblance was overrated. Miguel squeezed my hand under the table. That was his way of saying, "Don't make this complicated." I never did. Even when Clara grew into a woman with Rosa's posture and Rosa's smile, even when Rosa would linger too long when they spoke, touching her shoulder, asking questions only a mother would ask. I told myself it was affection. Now, after that whisper, it feels like prelude. That night, I took out the small tin box from the top shelf of my wardrobe, the one where I keep old photographs. There we were, me, Miguel, and baby Clara, wrapped in that same pink blanket. But the photograph I had always thought of as proof now felt staged, as if the light itself were hiding something. I noticed for the first time that I wasn't holding her tightly, that my arms looked awkward, uncertain. In the corner of the photo, you could see part of a hospital curtain, a blurred figure in white. Maybe Rosa, maybe not. I ran my thumb over it until the paper began to fade. I barely slept. When the sun rose, I decided to visit the hospital. It had changed names years ago, merged with another. The new receptionist couldn't help me, of course. Records that old were long transferred or destroyed. I stood there, surrounded by the smell of disinfectant and new paint, and felt time fold in on itself. The place was modern now. Glass, chrome, efficiency. But I could still see us in the corridors of memory. 2 young nurses moving between rooms, hands steady, hearts open. We used to joke that nothing could surprise us after so many births and deaths. I was wrong. At home, the apartment felt smaller, as if the walls had drawn closer. I made soup, spooned it halfway, and left it untouched. I thought of calling Clara, but what would I say? Darling, someone told me you might belong to another woman? She would think I was losing my mind. In truth, I wasn't sure I wasn't. Still, I noticed details I had ignored for years. The way Clara's handwriting curved like Rosa's. The faint scar above her eyebrow from a fall that Rosa, not I, had bandaged while I was working late. The memories aligned too neatly now, forming a pattern I didn't want to see. That evening, I took out the safe key. I had not used it in 20 years. Miguel had always said it contained legal things, insurance papers, his will, documents best left untouched. He was meticulous, secretive in the way men of his era believed was noble. You don't need to worry about these things, he used to tell me. And I obeyed because obedience was the currency of peace. But Rosa's whisper had changed the exchange rate. I wanted to know what was inside. Not out of greed, but out of need. The desperate human need to make sense of love. Before I opened it, I sat for a long time on the edge of the bed, holding the key in my hand. I thought about what it meant to be a mother. Not the diapers and the meals and the long nights with fevers, but the way you carry another soul in your thoughts for a lifetime. I had done that for Clara, whether or not she was born of me. Did a revelation erase that? Could biology unmake the years of tending, worrying, forgiving? I didn't know. All I knew was that I could no longer live with the doubt gnawing at the edges of memory. I didn't open the safe that night. Instead, I wrote in my journal, something I hadn't done in decades. If Rosa was right, then what am I now? I underlined the question twice and closed the book. The wind from the sea rattled the window panes. Somewhere in the distance, a foghorn moaned, low, steady, mournful. It sounded like a voice calling from another time. When I finally went to bed, I left the light on. I was afraid of the dark, not because of what it hid, but because of what it might reveal when I could no longer look away. The next morning, I found the safe key still in my hand, the imprint of its teeth pressed into my palm. That's how you know the truth is ready to be found, when it starts leaving marks before you even touch it. The next morning, I went to Rosa's apartment to gather her belongings for the hospice to donate. It was a small place, filled with the quiet residue of a life lived among other people's stories. The air still carried that faint blend of lavender oil and old paper that always surrounded her. And for a moment, I expected her to step out of the kitchen and scold me for coming without breakfast. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, turning dust into something that almost looked like grace. I walked through the rooms carefully, as if she might still be listening, my hand gliding across the back of her favorite chair. On the table sat a stack of hospital newsletters, the latest one still open to the obituary section. Her own name hadn't yet been printed there. Beside it, a wooden box with a broken hinge caught my eye. Rosa never liked disorder. She would have fixed that hinge the same day it cracked. The box was out of place, left slightly open as if waiting for someone to notice. Inside were papers, photographs, a few rosary beads, and a folded napkin that smelled faintly of disinfectant and talcum powder. I lifted the napkin, and underneath it lay a single black and white photograph, thin and faded with age. At first I thought it was one of those old training pictures we used to take at the hospital, nurses standing in formation around a new mother. But when I looked closer, I saw myself, my younger face, hollow with exhaustion but smiling faintly, holding a newborn in a white blanket. The name tag attached to the infant's wrist was barely visible in the blur, but I could make out enough letters to feel the room tilt. It wasn't my last name. It wasn't even close. The baby's surname was written in a hand I didn't recognize. The date printed at the bottom of the photo matched the day Clara was born. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My fingers trembled so violently that the photograph almost slipped from my hand. I pressed it against my chest, afraid that if I looked again the name would change, or worse, that it wouldn't. There were more papers in the box. Hospital forms, unsigned discharge notes, and at the very bottom, a small envelope sealed with a strip of yellowed tape. My name was written across it in Rosa's careful handwriting. For Elena, if she ever asks. The same phrasing Miguel had used years ago about his mysterious documents. The same soft coercion disguised as care. I didn't open it right away. I placed the envelope back into the box and sat down on Rosa's bed, staring at the wallpaper she had chosen decades ago, pale blue with tiny white flowers. It felt like being inside a memory that had turned against me. I thought about the night she whispered those words, the way her eyes had softened, the peace that had settled on her face. It was not malice. It was release. Whatever secret she had carried all those years had weighed heavier on her than on me, and she had finally laid it down. But now, that weight was mine. I went to the window and looked out at the narrow street below. A boy was kicking a ball against a wall, his mother calling for him from an open balcony. That sound, the unthinking authority of maternal love, broke something inside me. I sat back down and finally opened the envelope. Inside, just a single sheet of lined paper, written in the same looping hand. Forgive me for what I did. It was not cruelty. It was protection. You were too kind, and kindness is dangerous when the world decides who deserves a child. The letter ended there. No signature, no explanation. My pulse roared in my ears. Protection from what? From whom? The air in the apartment grew thick, and I had to step outside to breathe. As I walked home, every step felt rehearsed, as if I were retracing a path I had taken before without knowing it. The photograph burned against my palm through the pocket of my coat. People passed me on the street, nodding politely, but their faces blurred into the fog of my thoughts. I kept hearing the word protection, repeating it silently until it lost its meaning. When I reached my building, I didn't take the elevator. I climbed the stairs slowly, counting each step like a rosary. At the door, I hesitated, key poised above the lock, afraid that everything inside would look different now that I had seen the photograph. And of course, it did. The living room, once full of ordinary comfort, now seemed curated, staged. Every framed picture of Clara was evidence and accusation at once. I spread the photograph on the kitchen table beside my teacup and stared at it until the tea went cold. The baby in my arms had her eyes closed, mouth open, in that strange half-smile newborns have when they're dreaming of a world before words. There was something unfamiliar in her face, even in the grainy black and white. A shape of the nose, the faint curve of the chin. I wanted to tell myself it was just the quality of the photo, but the lie wouldn't hold. I had spent 56 years memorizing every line of that face as it grew. And yet this photograph showed a beginning that didn't belong to me. That night, I dreamed of the hospital corridors as they used to be, long, tiled, echoing with the cries of babies. Rosa was there, moving down the hall in her white uniform, her hands full of birth records, her face turned away. I tried to call to her, but my voice didn't carry. I woke with the taste of antiseptic in my mouth and a single phrase repeating in my mind: protection is a kind of theft. I didn't know where I had heard it. Maybe I had just invented it in my sleep. But it felt true. The next morning, I went through the drawer where Miguel kept our documents. Most were dull. Tax forms, utility receipts, certificates. But beneath them lay a small metal key labeled safe. The handwriting was his, neat and businesslike. I sat there for a long time, with that key resting on my palm, feeling its cold weight. I thought of all the times I had asked him, "What's in there?" And all the times he had smiled and said, "Nothing you need to worry about." I had believed that because I wanted to. Love makes us lazy about truth. It convinces us that peace is proof of goodness. Now I knew better. By noon, the photograph and Rosa's letter lay side by side on the table, silent as witnesses. I felt like I was preparing evidence for a trial where I was both the accused and the judge. I wasn't angry yet. Anger requires certainty, and I was still floating in the gray fog between disbelief and recognition. But beneath that fog was something older, a kind of primal knowing that had been whispering all along. Every time I doubted my memory of the birth, every time Clara looked at me with polite distance, every time Rosa's eyes lingered too long when she saw us together, all of it had been trying to tell me what I was only now ready to hear. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine, the cheap kind I reserve for company I never have anymore. I sat by the window watching the waves darken with dusk. My reflection in the glass looked almost like another woman, one who knew the truth and was waiting for me to catch up. I spoke to her softly so as not to startle her. "Tomorrow, we open it." She didn't argue. She just nodded, as if she'd been waiting 50 years for that sentence. I went to bed without turning on the light. The sound of the sea filled the room, and for the first time since Rosa's whisper, I felt a strange calm. Not peace, exactly. More like the stillness before an incision, when everything holds its breath, knowing that pain is coming, but also the possibility of healing. I did not open the safe the next day, though I had promised my reflection I would, because promises made to mirrors are easy to postpone when daylight arrives with its errands and its phone calls and what we still dare to call obligations. So instead, I cleaned the kettle twice and folded dish towels that did not need folding and watered the balcony geraniums so slowly it felt like prayer. And then I sat back down in front of the photograph and the thin letter from Rosa and tried to persuade myself that doubt is a form of wisdom, that waiting might be kinder than tearing the seam at once, and for a few minutes that story almost held, until a breeze slipped under the window and rattled the paper, and I watched the black and white infants tag tremble. And I heard again the hush of Rosa's voice, and I knew that waiting was just a more elegant name for fear. Still, I did not reach for the key. I reached for the telephone, because before you cut the cloth, you talk to the person who wears it. And so I dialed Clara and listened to the faraway ring that always takes longer than it should and prepares a mother's heart for disappointment. And when she answered, she sounded busy in the way successful daughters practice, a soft rush of competent noise, and I said her name and she said mine. But she said it the way people say unknown caller. And I told her I had been to Rosa's apartment, and there were papers that unsettled me, and a photograph that raised questions, and perhaps we should meet for coffee and look at them together. And she paused just long enough to be polite before telling me that this week was impossible because of meetings, and the next week was complicated because of a conference, and perhaps the week after. That would be of the how the on a saucer by someone who has finished being kind. And I stared at the phone and told myself that I had imagined the almost sigh because grief makes an archivist out of anyone, sorting sounds for evidence. And yet the room felt colder after our conversation. I decided small shovels and a laugh that forgives your wallet before you reach for it. Asked after Rosa, because she had seen us together for years, and she called us the nurses, even though our uniforms had long since become sweaters and practical shoes. And when I told her the news, her face changed into the solemn kindness people learn from funerals. And she wrapped the loaf twice and tucked in 2 almond cookies with a conspiratorial look as if we were doing something illegal and delicious. And I thanked her and walked back through the neighborhood where laundry lines draw geometry above the alleyways and cats consider themselves municipal officials. And as I turned the corner by the pharmacy, I saw the hospital shuttle pause at the light, the new blue logo shiny as a confession, and in its windows a scatter of faces, some tired, some joyful, some empty, in the way of waiting rooms. And I thought about the conveyor belt of expectation that moves through those corridors, the belief that institutions are better at truth than people are. And I felt a stubborn flare of anger at my own credulity, which is the kind of anger that does not shout but stares and cleans its eyeglasses slowly. Back home, I laid the bread on the table and did not cut it, because to cut it would have required a decision about butter or oil, and a decision about butter or oil would have required an appetite, and appetite was something I had misplaced somewhere, between the photograph and Clara's pause. So instead, I opened the window and let the sea air climb over the sill, and I took out my old nursing notebook, the one with a cracked spine and a pocket of carbon paper at the back, a relic from a period when we charted on paper you could smudge into mercy, and I turned to a page that had recorded nothing more momentous than a list of night shift reminders, and I began to write to Rosa as if she were on the other side of the desk. You said, she is not my daughter, but I carried her love the way a bat carries a basket uphill, and you watched me. And if what you did was protection, then tell me from what? And if it was theft, then tell me what you took, because I need a ledger that balances. And the beat. Words steadied me, not because they solved anything, but because the quiet work of laying them down felt like setting a table for someone who might still arrive. And sometimes, that is all a woman needs to keep from vanishing into her own doubt. In the afternoon, the mail arrived with its elastic band and its catalogs that dream of kitchens I will never cook in again. And tucked among them was a thin envelope from the hospital's archives department, responding to an online inquiry I had sent months ago for an entirely different reason, a genealogical whim, and I opened it now as if the universe had finally aligned its bureaucracies, and inside there was nothing helpful, only a form letter explaining that records from that period were incomplete due to renovations, and a sentence that said, certain maternal infant logbooks were destroyed pursuant to policy. And I sat very still because policy is a word people deploy when they need to send guilt to the dry cleaner. And I ran my finger under the sentence as if it were braille, and I could feel the shape of erasure. And I thought about how secrecy ages into custom, and custom ages into law. And then the truth is considered impolite. And I felt that weary heat behind my eyes, that warns of tears. But the tears did not come, because tears would have been a decision, and I was too tired for decisions. So instead, I put the letter under the bread like a paper plate, and told myself that I would not be fed by silence. Toward evening, the sky bruised itself into a beautiful color, the kind painters purchase in tubes with names like Dusk Orchard, and the gulls began their tedious jurisdictional disputes over the pier. And I remembered a small thing I had not allowed myself to remember before, a night in the ward when a young mother hemorrhaged and we moved like a single body. Rosa at the head, me at the line, and the obstetrician murmuring numbers like a rainstorm. And after the crisis passed, Rosa leaned against the tiled wall and closed her eyes and said, "Sometimes the world takes the wrong person, and the best we can do is give another person back." And at the time, it sounded like one of those noble sayings people stitch onto samplers to keep from hearing the screaming, but now it returned to me with a different weight, and I could see how a belief like that, put into the hands of a woman who has limited power but unlimited tenderness, could become a tool, and tools can build or break, depending on the instructions they receive. That night, I called no one, not even the neighbor who always tells me about her son's dog, as if reciting a litany, and I turned off the television because I did not want the armor of other people's stories, and I made chamomile tea I did not drink. Because comfort presumes trust, and trust was the floor that had shifted under me, and I went to the wardrobe and touched the safe key and then hung it back on its hook because ritual is a way of telling ourselves we are still choosing. And then I sat at the window and watched the silhouettes of couples on the promenade, their shoulders leaning toward each other in that unconscious geometry that announces possession. And I felt a peculiar freedom tinged with cruelty, the freedom of understanding that love is not a deed of title that can be revoked by a clerk, that I could both be wronged and still be the mother, that two truths can occupy a single room without shaking hands, and that realization, fragile and dangerous, climbed inside my chest and made a nest. I slept badly and woke early, and in the pale hour when even the birds seem undecided, I dialed the old number of a retired midwife who used to work with us, a woman who hid her shrewdness behind gossip the way a smuggler hides diamonds in pastry. And when she answered, she recognized my voice in the gracious way the past recognizes itself, and we spoke around the matter first, around the prices of vegetables, and the scandal of the new director, and the way gloves rip more easily now because everything is cheaper but billed as premium. And then I asked, as if we were discussing weather, whether she remembered any confusion in the nursery that week, anything unusual with bracelets or bassinets, and she grew quiet in a way that told me the question had already visited her memory uninvited, and she said slowly that there had been a departmental review sometime after, an internal thing no one wanted in the papers, and the language used was irregularities not affecting outcomes. And We both laughed once, sharply, at the bureaucratic poetry of that phrase. And then she said, Rosa had been praised for her steadiness during a staffing shortage, and I thanked her, and we said the words that old colleagues say when they put down a story. They cannot lift together. Take care of yourself, which is code for this will not be fixed today. When I hung up, I realized that the first escalation had already done its work. I had moved from confusion to inquiry, from inquiry to suspicion, from suspicion to a trembling kind of knowledge that refuses to call itself by its name. I had felt the subtle winds of distance from my daughter, and the soft wall of indifference from the institution, and the echo of intention in Rosa's letter. And each of those was another turn of the winch that draws the truth up from the well where we throw inconvenient buckets, and if I did not yet have courage, I had momentum, and sometimes momentum is a more honest friend. So I washed the cup, and I took the bread knife, and I finally cut the loaf and ate a slice, standing at the counter, like a woman who has work to do. Because I did. And when the salt in the butter found the small cracked places on my lip, I welcomed the sting, not because I enjoy pain, but because honest pain is better than the dullness of a lie. And I looked at the safe key, which was not a talisman or a threat, but a simple tool. And I said aloud to no one, to Rosa, to myself, to the empty room, where two witnesses lay on the table, that tomorrow I would open it, not because I needed more suffering or even more proof, but because a life cannot be mended with bandages applied in the dark, and the sea answered in its blunt language, a long breath in and a long breath out, and my heart, a stubborn student, took note of the lesson. At dawn I opened the safe, not because I felt brave, but because the night had offered no alternative. There comes a moment when ignorance begins to taste metallic, like old coins pressed against the tongue, and the only way to rid yourself of it is to swallow the truth whole and hope it doesn't cut your throat on the way down. The safe sat in the corner of the wardrobe like a mute accomplice, its metal face dulled with dust, the key heavy in my hand as if it knew what waited behind its turn. When the inside lay folders neatly stacked, the geometry of Miguel's handwriting across every label, his devotion to order masquerading as integrity. Beneath, for Elena, if questions ever rise. It was like being addressed from the grave by a man who had rehearsed my eventual awakening. I sat on the floor, legs numb beneath me, and unfolded the letter that would split my life into before and after. My Elena, it began, you were born to heal, and that was both your gift and your danger. You forgive faster than others can confess. I have lived inside that forgiveness for a lifetime, and now must ask you for one last portion of it. When you woke after the operation, the doctors told me there were complications. They said the child would not survive. I cannot describe what that moment did to me except to say that a man who loses the future loses his reason. Rosa was there, and she told me another woman had given birth that same night, a young girl, unmarried, frightened, ready to abandon her baby to an orphanage. Rosa said, we could spare 2 lives at once, the girl's and yours. She said no one would know, that paperwork could be misplaced, names exchanged quietly. I told her it was madness, and she looked at me with a kind of ferocity I had never seen in her before, and said that love and mercy often look like madness in the moment. I agreed. I told myself that love was justification enough. I have lived every day since with the knowledge that I stole one truth to preserve another. If I could undo it, I would. But the world does not issue receipts for the heart's crimes. I only ask that when you discover this, you remember that everything that followed was real. Your sleepless nights, her laughter, our years as a family. They were built on a lie, yes, but also on devotion. Please forgive us both. The paper trembled in my hands, not because of my age, but because I realized that the man I had shared my bed with, the man whose absence I had mourned with honest tears, had written his own absolution before I even knew there was a sin. I read the letter 3 times, and by the third the words blurred into shapes, black wings fluttering across the page. Underneath the letter was a birth certificate folded around a second one. The first bore my name, the second the name of a girl I had never met. Both carried the same date, the same hospital, the same attending nurse. Rosa. The signatures looped together like strands of DNA, inseparable, complicit. Beneath them lay a photograph, one I had never seen. Rosa standing beside a crib, her face half in shadow, and in her arms a newborn with the same small mouth that would one day speak to me with the patience of a daughter I believed was mine. I sat there for a long time, the morning light creeping across the floor toward me, touching my knees, then the papers, then my face. It felt like judgment. Outside, the city was waking, garbage trucks grumbling, dogs pulling their owners toward routine. But in that small room, the air stood still. I realized that grief is not always for the dead. Sometimes it is for the self you can no longer be. I thought of Miguel's calm smile at family dinners, his quietness during Rosa's visits, his insistence that Clara's baptism be handled privately. Each memory reassembled itself with new meaning, as if the past had been waiting in pieces for me to build the correct shape. I placed the documents back into the safe, but kept the letter. There are betrayals too personal to return to their cage. I made coffee that tasted like burnt wood and stared out at the sea. The waves looked the same as they had yesterday, indifferent to revelations. That indifference steadied me. I knew then that I could not spend what remained of my life chasing a biology that did not belong to me. Yet I also knew I could not remain silent. To live with half a truth is to live half a life. The only person who could finish this story was Clara, and though I feared her answer, I feared cowardice more. I called her again, and when she didn't answer, I wrote. The letter began stiffly, the way all difficult letters do, with pleasantries to cushion the blow. But soon my pen began to move faster, carried by something older than courage. The need to be witnessed. I told her I had opened the safe and that her father had written to me. I did not accuse or plead. I simply laid out the facts like a table set for a meal we might one day share. I told her that no secret, however noble, could erase the decades between us, that motherhood is not a certificate, but an accumulation of gestures. The way I had held her during storms, the songs I hummed when she had fevers, the forgiveness I gave her long before she asked for it. I ended with a single line. Whatever name the world gave you, you were mine in the ways that mattered. I sealed it before I could reread it, because sometimes rereading is a form of retreat. At the post office, the clerk weighed the envelope as if calculating the gravity of my confession. When he handed me the receipt, I slipped it into my wallet beside an old photograph of Clara at 12, missing a front tooth, her laughter unguarded, still belonging to us both. On the walk home, the city looked slightly altered, edges sharper, colors less forgiving. I felt as though I had stepped out of a painting and seen the brushstrokes. People were kind enough to nod, but their kindness was ornamental. They could not imagine that an old woman carrying groceries was balancing an entire lineage on her back. At home, exhaustion arrived, not as sleep, but as stillness. I sat in the armchair until twilight, letterless now, emptied of effort. Then the phone rang. I expected a telemarketer, but it was Clara's voice, careful, neutral, the voice of someone entering a room full of smoke. She said she had received my letter and would come tomorrow. There was no anger in her tone, only fatigue. After she hung up, I felt the room swell with the anticipation of an argument I wasn't sure I wanted to win. I tidied instinctively, as if the house could absorb some of the order my heart lacked. That night, I dreamed of holding 2 infants at once, one in each arm, unable to tell which one was breathing. When I woke, dawn had just begun to bruise the horizon, and I understood that tomorrow's conversation would not be about blame, but about endurance. There are truths that do not heal, but simply allow 2 people to coexist with the wound exposed. Still, I needed to see her face when she learned that the story she had lived inside had seams, that the woman she called mother had been, unknowingly, the beneficiary of another woman's despair. She arrived. I poured tea, the domestic choreography of civility, and handed her Miguel's letter. She read it in silence, her eyes moving evenly, lips pressed together. When she finished, she did not cry. She asked if I believed it. I said I had no choice. Then she, Clara, that's all it said, foundation. She touched. When evening came, I returned to the safe and locked it again, not to hide the truth, but to mark the end of discovery. The light outside had turned the color of pewter, and for the first time in weeks, I felt neither fear nor confusion, only a strange clarity. The truth had not destroyed me. It had defined the borders of my forgiveness. It moved with the same patient rhythm it always had, unconcerned with human stories. And in that steady motion, I sensed the faintest pulse of peace, the kind that comes not from resolution, but from recognition. The midpoint between grief and grace, where you finally stop asking why and start learning how to live after. The morning after Clara's visit, the apartment felt too clean, as if tidiness itself were an apology for something I hadn't done wrong. The teacups still sat on the table where we had left them, one with a ring of lipstick too precise to be mistaken for affection, the other with the faint imprint of my trembling hand. The silence that followed her departure was not peaceful. It was administrative, the kind that comes after the closing of a case. I stood in the middle of the room, waiting for anger or tears, but neither arrived. What came instead was the slow realization that I had been dismissed, not from her life exactly, but from her narrative. I was now a supporting character in a story that no longer required my presence. The discovery of the truth had not united us. It had merely clarified the distance. For a few days, I tried to continue as before, moving through my routines like an understudy learning a role she had once performed by instinct. I caught myself speaking aloud sometimes, explaining my actions to no one, saying things like, "Let's not waste the milk," or "We'll water the plants tomorrow." And each time the plural burned a little more, the we shrinking into a ghost of companionship that no longer existed. When I met neighbors on the stairs, they asked after Clara, and I said she was fine, busy, thriving, all the adjectives that make other people comfortable. I smiled with the practiced serenity of the deceived who have become experts at decorum. One evening, as I sorted through the safe papers again, trying to decide whether to destroy them or preserve them as a record of our collective weakness, the telephone rang. The sound startled me. No one called at that hour unless something was wrong. It was Clara, her voice clipped, professional, the way she sounded when speaking to subordinates. She said she had been thinking about what I'd told her, and that she wanted to clarify some things before the matter became distorted. I asked what she meant by distorted, and she said that Rosa's actions were illegal, that the switch was, technically, a crime, and that if I ever spoke of it publicly, there could be unpleasant consequences. The phrasing chilled me. Not because I intended to publicize it, but because it revealed how thoroughly she had shifted from daughter to custodian of her own reputation. I asked if she thought I would betray her, and she sighed in that weary way that suggests the question itself is naive. "It's not about trust, Mother," she said. "It's about discretion. People build their lives on certain narratives. You of all people should understand that." Then she added almost gently, "Let's not relive the past. It doesn't change anything." I wanted to tell her that it changed everything, that the past is not an archive but a bloodstream, circulating through every word and gesture we inherit. But she was already saying goodbye, promising to visit when things calmed down, and the line went dead before I could find a sentence strong enough to bridge the gap. I held the receiver for a long time, hearing the faint hum of connection still alive on the other end. And then I replaced it carefully, as if handling fragile evidence. That night, I dreamed of Rosa again, but not as a nurse. She was standing at the edge of the sea, wearing the same white uniform she had been buried in, the fabric clinging to her legs like waves. She was holding an infant, but when I tried to approach, the child's face kept changing. First Clara's, then mine, then no face at all, only a blank oval of light. I woke with my heart pounding and the smell of salt on my lips, though the windows were closed. It was not fear I felt, but summons, as if the dead were asking me to finish something they had left incomplete. The next morning, a letter arrived addressed to Mrs. Elena Morales. Private. The handwriting was unfamiliar, slanted, almost theatrical. Inside was a single sheet of paper from a law firm I didn't recognize, informing me that Rosa's estate, small as it was, had been left entirely to a charitable foundation under Clara's management. There was also a note attached from Clara herself, explaining that Rosa had named her executor years ago and that, out of respect for everyone's memory, it was best not to contest the matter. I stared at the signature, her full name, written with that deliberate flourish she had copied from Miguel's old business letters, and understood that she was consolidating her control over the narrative, rewriting history one legal clause at a time. I spent the afternoon walking by the harbor, the wind sharp enough to feel cleansing. The gulls circled above like arguments with no resolution. I passed the old hospital, now renovated into an outpatient clinic, and for a moment I thought about going inside, asking for records, speaking to someone who might still remember. But the rational part of me knew it was futile. People move on. Institutions shed their skin. Even the walls forget. Yet, it struck me that compassion is the only inheritance no one can falsify. When I returned home, the answering machine was blinking. It was a message from Clara, short and controlled. "Mother, please don't involve anyone else in this. It's better if we let it fade. I'm handling everything." That word, handling, scraped against me. It reduced decades of love and confusion into a problem to be managed. I deleted the message and sat in the dark, listening to the sea pounding the rocks below. For the first time, I wondered if silence could be a form of complicity, if by agreeing to forget I was protecting not Clara, not Miguel, not even Rosa, but the very system that had allowed such thefts of identity to masquerade as mercy. And yet, amid that social unease, I felt a strange strengthening inside me. I had nothing left to protect. One evening, I found myself writing again, not to Rosa this time, but to the unnamed girl whose child had been taken. "I don't know your name," I wrote, "but I have lived with your absence for more than half a century. Your daughter grew into someone intelligent and proud, and though she does not love easily, she is loved. I wish I could give you that comfort in person. I wish I could say your loss created only beauty, but that would be a lie. It created confusion, too. A confusion that shaped us all. Still, I thank you, whoever you are, for letting me borrow her life long enough to learn what love costs when it begins in deception." I did not send the letter, of course. There was nowhere to send it. But writing it released something. A knot that had been lodged beneath my ribs for years without my knowing. A week later, Clara appeared unannounced, dressed in her executive uniform of certainty. She said she had been reviewing some of Rosa's old papers and found documents that could complicate things if mishandled. I asked what kind of documents, and she hesitated before admitting they included the second birth certificate, the one with the other mother's name. She wanted it destroyed. When I told her I couldn't do that it belonged to history now, she grew cold. "You don't understand," she said. "These things linger. They make people talk." I replied that perhaps people should talk, that silence had already lasted too long, but she shook her head. "You're romanticizing it. Some truths serve no purpose except to ruin what's left." Her words stung because they were not entirely wrong. I watched her gather the documents with the efficiency of a surgeon removing infection, and I saw in her movements both fear and pity. When she left, I followed her to the door, and for a moment I thought she might turn back, might ask for forgiveness or at least acknowledgement. Instead, she said, without looking at me, "You were a good caretaker, Mother. That should be enough." The word caretaker lodged in my chest like a splinter. After she left, I opened the window wide, letting the night air pour in, and I whispered to the darkness. I was not a caretaker. I was a mother. The wind took my words, scattering them into the sea. In the days that followed, I felt a new current running through me. Not bitterness, not grief, but something cleaner, more deliberate. I began sorting through old journals, letters, photographs, building an archive of the truth before it could vanish. I labeled each envelope carefully: Rosa, Miguel, Clara, hospital records. It was not revenge that guided me, but preservation. The stubborn insistence that even flawed lives deserve a witness. I decided to leave everything with my lawyer, along with a statement explaining what had happened. It was not a legal claim, but a confession to time itself. As I sealed the final envelope, I felt an unexpected calm. The years of uncertainty had hardened into clarity. I no longer needed Clara's recognition to validate my motherhood. The act of naming the truth had already restored my dignity. Still, that night, as I prepared for bed, I imagined her face if she ever read my statement after I was gone. Would she feel betrayal or relief? Or nothing at all? Perhaps nothing. And perhaps that too would be justice, a balance restored not by reconciliation, but by honesty. I went to the balcony one last time before sleep. The city lights flickered below, reflected on the water like scattered coins. Somewhere out there, the woman whose child I had unknowingly raised was either gone or still living, unaware of me, unaware that her loss had been both my salvation and my curse. I thought of Rosa, of her trembling voice the day she whispered the truth, of Miguel's careful handwriting justifying love with deceit, of Clara's composed face when she said she already knew. We were all accomplices to survival, each protecting what we believed must not break. But survival is not the same as living. It's merely the refusal to die. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the apartment like memory itself, uninvited but persistent. And I realized that forgiveness is not an act, but a practice. A repetition of letting go even when the hands want to hold. I could not change Clara, nor resurrect Rosa, nor meet the girl who had been erased. But I could continue breathing in a world that had tried to convince me my love was counterfeit. That, I decided, would be my quiet defiance. The next morning, I placed the sealed envelope on my lawyer's desk and walked home through streets washed clean by rain. The air smelled of iron and salt. I felt lighter, not because the past had lessened, but because I had finally stopped carrying it alone. When I reached the apartment, I brewed coffee and sat by the window. The sea was restless, but within its endless movement there was a rhythm I understood now. The rhythm of things that return and return until they are no longer questions, but simply part of the tide. It happened on a Thursday, the kind of day that pretends to be ordinary until something irreversible decides to reveal itself. The sky was low and colorless, the kind of sky that presses on your shoulders, and the apartment was filled with that quiet before rain, when everything holds its breath. I had gone to the lawyer's office the previous week and left my written statement with him, believing that would be the final act of my small rebellion. But the truth has a way of insisting on its own timing. That morning, an envelope arrived addressed in Clara's handwriting, sharp and efficient, the handwriting of someone who always knows the right form. Inside was my own letter to the lawyer, returned without explanation, along with a note from her. Mother, please stop this. I cannot protect you if you continue. The word protect, once so comforting, now sounded like the prelude to erasure. She was no longer speaking to me as a daughter. She was speaking as an enforcer of silence, a curator of a history where I existed only in the margins. I sat there with the envelope open on the table, watching the rain begin to thread down the glass, and I felt something inside me shift, not snap, not break, but align, as if my spine had remembered its original purpose. All my life I had practiced patience as if it were a virtue. I had believed endurance was a form of love, that to accept, to yield, to remain silent in the name of harmony made me good. But good I looked around the apartment, at the framed photographs on the wall, each one a performance of happiness. Birthdays, graduations, dinners, posed smiles. I saw the entire museum of a life curated to reassure others that everything was fine. And I realized that if I died tomorrow, the only story left behind would be the official one, the counterfeit version where everyone had done the right thing for the right reasons. I couldn't allow that. I decided to go to the hospital one last time, not to search for records or proof, but to stand in the place where the lie began, to look at its walls and call it by its name. It took me longer to walk there than I remembered. The building. No one. I stood in the corridor for a long time, breathing the same air that had once carried my first cry as a mother, or what I had believed was mine. I found a bench near the end of the hallway, under a plaque listing the names of donors and founders. Her voice was kind, the kind of kindness that comes from training rather than empathy, and I wanted to tell her everything, to pour the entire weight of history into her clean uniform. But instead, I asked to see the administrator. The nurse hesitated, but eventually led me to an office with frosted glass and a desk that looked like it had never known paper cuts. The administrator was polite in the way people are when they sense a story they don't want to inherit. I told her who I was, when I had worked there, what had happened, and what had been hidden. She listened without interrupting, her pen hovering over a notepad she never used. Beyond the scope, as if morality had an expiration date. I reached into my bag and placed Miguel's letter on her desk. "This," I said, "is your scope." She looked at the envelope, but didn't touch it. I realized it would stay, whether she wanted it or not. A fragment of unapproved truth, lodged in the machinery of official silence. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air was clean, almost metallic, as if the storm had scrubbed the sky. I walked to the promenade, the sea glinting under a thin sun. Everything felt sharper, more vivid. The cries of the gulls, the salt on my lips, the uneven rhythm of my steps. I stopped near the railing where the waves struck hardest and took the second envelope from my coat pocket. It contained a copy of Miguel's confession and a letter I had written for Clara, the final one. I had rewritten it the night before, removing all apology. I wrote simply, "I release you. The truth is yours now. Do what you will with it. But know this: love does not vanish when it loses its disguise. It simply changes address." I stood there for a long time, holding the envelope against the wind, then let it go. It fluttered once, twice, and then was taken, disappearing into the gray water. I did not imagine it floating to her or dissolving gracefully. I knew it would sink, heavy with ink, joining the sediment of 1,000 other secrets. And somehow, that knowledge soothed me. When I returned home, the apartment no longer felt like a waiting room. It felt inhabited, awake. I made soup and ate it slowly, each spoonful grounding me in the present. For the first time in months, food had taste again. Afterward, I sat by the window with my journal and wrote without thinking, letting the words spill unedited. I wrote about Rosa's trembling hands, about Miguel's quiet betrayal, about Clara's cold mercy, about my own years of pretending not to see what was in front of me. I wrote until the pen ran dry, and then I kept writing with the pressure of the tip, carving the page. It wasn't anger or grief anymore. It was testimony. When I finished, I looked at my hands, old, veined, still steady, and I realized that for all the lies told around me, these hands had never lied. They had delivered babies, comforted the dying, built meals, stitched wounds, and held the truth even when I was not ready to face it. Later that evening, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find a courier holding a package. Inside was a single item: the pink baby blanket from the photograph, folded neatly, no note attached. I knew immediately who had sent it. Clara. It was both an accusation and a farewell. She was giving me the symbol of a motherhood she no longer wished to acknowledge. I pressed the blanket to my face and inhaled. It still smelled faintly of disinfectant and lavender, Rosa's scent. I felt neither rage nor sorrow, only a deep, resonant understanding. This was her way of returning me to the beginning, closing the circle. I folded the blanket again and placed it in the drawer beside my bed, not as evidence, not as relic, but as reminder that even borrowed love leaves its own scent. That night, I wrote one last letter, addressed to no one. Today, I began, I performed an act that cannot be undone. I have placed the truth where it cannot be erased, and I have released what was never mine to keep. I am lighter now. I am no longer afraid of being forgotten, because what remains of me will be honest. I signed my name and left the page open on the desk. Outside, the sea was dark and endless, the tide moving toward morning. I sat by the window until the first light appeared, pale and patient. For the first time, I felt entirely present in my own story, unborrowed, unclaimed, whole. When the sun finally broke the horizon, I whispered a single sentence, not to Rosa, not to Miguel, not even to Clara, but to the universe itself. It is done. And the words did not echo. They settled quietly into the air, final and complete, like the last stitch on a wound that has finally decided to close. In the weeks that followed, life did not transform itself into something radiant or newly heroic, and perhaps that is the mercy of surviving the truth. Because instead of fireworks, there was breakfast. There was the sound of buses turning the corner. There was the plant on the windowsill, remembering to be green. And I found that the ordinary became not a consolation prize, but the first honest language my days had spoken in a long time. So I rose early and let the kettle hum. I walked to the pier and counted the gulls like blessings I did not need to deserve. I bought oranges from the grocer, who always cuts one open and offers a wedge as proof that sweetness exists without requesting permission. And when I returned, I opened the drawer with the pink blanket and pressed my palm to it for a breath. Not to resurrect anything, not to punish myself, but to accept that love leaves residue even when the rooms have been cleared. And in that acceptance, I felt a slow rearranging of the furniture. Inside my chest, the heavy pieces pushed back to the walls, a space opening in the middle large enough to sit down and breathe without apologizing to anyone alive or dead. I did not speak what I once said to its hospital pray bright. That evening, I wrote my name inside the old nursing notebook, and beneath it, a single line that felt both like an ending and a charter. I was a mother in the ways that require endurance more than proof, and I survived the accounting. The lawyer, without the story reverting to its counterfeit version, and he paused in that respectful way a person does when they hear a request that sounds like a prayer and a contract at once, and he said he would honor it. And for the first time since Miguel's letter, I felt the peculiar luxury of being witnessed by someone with no stake in my blood. I began to walk farther along the shore, passing the benches where widowers sit with their sandwiches and their newspapers. And sometimes I sat among them and chewed my bread slowly. And one of them, a quiet man whose jacket smelled faintly of lemon, Polish, told me that his wife appears to him in the corner of his eye when the light is about to turn, not to beckon, only to confirm that turning is still possible, and we nodded like two people agreeing with the tide. I found that I spoke less as the days lengthened, and when words did appear, they were measured and clean. Not because I had learned eloquence, but because I no longer felt the obligation to convince anyone, least of all myself, that I belonged. When the first real spring rain came, I opened every window and let the apartment smell like a childhood kitchen without the pain of childhood. And I brewed tea and left the cup on the sill to warm the damp air. And I wrote a card to no address in particular, locked, that each morning when I face myself, I must look past that instruction to find my reflection. And in that small obstacle, I have found a teacher. Some nights I still dream of 2 bassinets and no labels. But I wake without panic because I know that the question of origin is no longer a threat to the fact of devotion. And when I sit at the window watching the dark water write its long sentences, against the rocks, I think, with a steadiness I could not have imagined years ago, that I am finally living without auditioning for the part of a woman who has not been harmed, which is to say, I am living. If there is anything left to say, it is only this, offered to the woman reading with her heart braced like a door. Do not wait for the nurse to whisper, for the lawyer to stamp, for the daughter to bless, for the world to approve the way you rescue yourself. Take your hand to the safe you have hidden, behind obligations and the opinions of people who like you better confused. Take the key from the hook where you hung it in order to seem agreeable, and turn it. And if what you find is unbearable, bear it a little at a time until it becomes the ground under your feet, because ground is only former falling that learned how to stay. And if what you find is love that came to you by an unforgivable road, forgive yourself for walking it as cleanly as you knew how. Then choose the next road with your eyes open and the map in your pocket and no escort but your breath. As for me, I have placed my papers where light can reach them. I have put my name on the truth the way one puts a name on the inside of a coat before winter. And I have learned to sleep without rehearsing explanations, which is not triumph, but peace. And peace is not the absence of memory. It is the soft agreement you make with everything that happened when you decide to continue anyway. If you come to my door one day to tell me your version, I will make soup and listen without interrupting. And when you are finished, I will hand you the sticker of the bright-eyed bird and say nothing except that flight is not an argument. It is a decision, and you are allowed to make it as late as today.